September 7th, 1191. Somewhere on the coastal road to Jaffa. The hospitaller marshal has had enough. For 6 hours, arrows have rained down on his men. Horses scream and collapse. Knights bleed inside their armor. His Grand Master has begged King Richard 3 times for permission to charge. 3 times, Richard has refused. The Muslim drums pound louder. The arrows fall thicker. Then, a trumpet blares from somewhere in the chaos. The marshal thinks it's the signal. He kicks his spurs. His horse lunges forward. One knight sees him go and follows. Then another. 3 men charging into 25,000. Half a mile ahead, King Richard the Lionheart sees the breach. He has 3 seconds to decide. Let those men die alone, or commit his entire army to an unauthorized charge he never ordered. This is the moment that saved the Third Crusade. But to understand it, we need to go back 12 days. The siege was over. Acre had fallen back into Christian hands after 2 brutal years. Saladin had agreed to terms: ransom the garrison, return the True Cross, release prisoners. Standard siege diplomacy. But Saladin began to delay. He inserted new conditions. He played for time. Richard the Lionheart was not a patient man. On a hot morning, he marched the prisoners out of the city. His soldiers moved through them with swords and spears. It took hours. Saladin, when he heard, executed every Christian prisoner in his custody. 2 men who'd been negotiating like statesmen had just reminded each other they were at war. Neither could afford to lose now. With Acre secured, Richard turned south. His ultimate goal was Jerusalem, 40 miles inland, heavily fortified. The plan: march 130 kilometers down the coast to capture Jaffa, the port closest to Jerusalem. From there, use the coastal fortresses as springboards for a siege. Richard's army numbered 12,000 men. 1,200 were knights, heavy cavalry in full plate armor. The other 10,000 were infantry, crossbowmen, spearmen, the backbone of this campaign. The Templars, warrior monks in white mantles, held the vanguard. The Hospitallers held the rear guard. And Richard rode everywhere, checking cohesion, shouting orders, dragging stragglers back into line. Shadowing them from the eastern hills, Saladin's army. Over 25,000 men. The math was simple. If the Crusaders broke formation even once, they'd be surrounded and annihilated. Richard's strategy was born from cold pragmatism. March at dawn, rest at midday. Inside their armor, knights were cooking in the desert heat. The infantry formed a shield wall on the left, the landward side, protecting the knights behind them. On the right, the Mediterranean. A Crusader fleet sailed parallel, carrying supplies. But the most important rule: no one charges until I give the signal. 6 trumpet blasts. No other sound, no exceptions. If the line breaks, Richard told them, we all die. It sounded simple. It was the hardest thing any of them would ever do. Saladin unleashed his Turkic horse archers. Every day, groups would sweep down from the hills, loose arrows, and vanish. They targeted horses. A dead horse couldn't be replaced. The psychological toll was worse. The constant drums, the horns, the knowledge that at any moment you might die. Near Mount Carmel, Saladin's son tried to cut off the rear guard entirely. For a terrifying hour, the Hospitallers lost contact with the main column. Richard heard. He turned his cavalry around and rode hard into the chaos. The line held. Patience won the day. But patience has limits. By September 5th, the Crusaders approached the forest of Arsuf, a rare woodland, perfect for ambush. Saladin's brother, Al-Adil, known to the Crusaders as Saladin, sent an envoy to Richard. Let's talk peace, the message said. Negotiate terms. Avoid more bloodshed. Richard didn't trust it for a second, but he also saw an opportunity. He sent back a reply. Yes, let's talk. Let's meet tomorrow. The next morning, Saladin arrived with his entourage, expecting a long diplomatic dance. Richard met him with cold courtesy, made a few impossible demands. Give back all of Jerusalem, cede every conquered territory. And when Saladin balked, Richard smiled and said the talks were over. While Saladin had been stalling, thinking he was buying Saladin time, Richard had marched his entire army through the forest. By the time the negotiations collapsed, the Crusaders were already on the other side of the woods, emerging onto the open plain near the ruins of Arsuf Castle. And that's when they saw it. Saladin's entire army, arrayed across the plain like a storm made of steel and silk. 25,000 men, banners in green and gold, drums that seemed to shake the earth. The Sultan himself, mounted on a black horse, surrounded by his Mamluk bodyguard, the elite slave soldiers who die before letting an enemy touch him. The Crusaders kept marching, because stopping meant dying, and Richard hadn't given the signal, not yet. The Crusader army was no longer marching in a column. They'd shifted into something stranger, a battle formation that moved. The infantry faced left, toward the enemy, shields up, while the entire army shuffled south toward Arsuf. On the right, the sea. Safe. On the left, 25,000 reasons to stay in formation. Richard rode along the length of the column with the Duke of Burgundy, shouting encouragement, checking gaps, making sure no one was lagging. In his mind, Richard was doing math. If they charged too early, Saladin's cavalry would scatter, regroup, counterattack. If they charged too late, the formation would collapse from exhaustion. Timing was everything, and the only person who knew the right moment was him. Across the plain, Saladin was thinking the same thing in reverse. His strategy: pressure the Crusaders until one section broke ranks, then flood that gap with cavalry. For 6 hours, two of the greatest military minds of the medieval era played chess with living pieces. And then the pieces started making their own moves. Saladin gave the order. The Muslim army surged forward. Not a full charge, a controlled assault. Nubian infantry from the Egyptian contingent hit the rear guard from the right. Syrian cavalry under Al-Afdal smashed into them from the left. The Hospitallers, already exhausted from 12 days of harassment, suddenly found themselves being attacked on two sides. The arrows came in waves, not aimed shots, volume fire. The sky darkened. Crossbowmen in the Crusader line shot back, but they were outnumbered. For every Muslim archer they killed, two more took his place. Horses started to drop. An arrow through the eye, a javelin in the flank. The animals screamed and thrashed, throwing riders, creating chaos. The Hospitallers lost 400 horses in the first hour, 400 irreplaceable war horses. And still, Richard refused to give the order to charge. Garnier de Nablus, Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller, had been a soldier for 30 years. He was not a man given to panic. But as he watched his knights bleed and die while standing still, something inside him cracked. He spurred his horse forward, riding hard toward Richard. "Sire!" Garnier shouted over the din. "We cannot hold this! My men are being slaughtered. Give us permission to charge." Richard turned to him. "Not yet. Hold the line. My men are dying. They die faster if you break formation." Garnier stared at him. Then he turned his horse and rode back to the rear guard. His Hospitallers were furious. Some shouted at him directly. "Why do we not charge them at full gallop?" Garnier had no answer. Because the king said no, wasn't the answer warriors wanted to hear while their brothers died beside them. But Richard's logic was ruthless and correct. If the Hospitallers charged alone, they'd be surrounded and destroyed. Everything depended on everyone moving together at the exact right moment. On the Muslim side, confidence was building. Saladin rode between his divisions, his presence electrifying his troops. His Egyptian cavalry began a flanking maneuver, trying to swing around the seaward side. Crusader infantry on the beach rushed to block them. Shields locked, spears out. The pressure was unbearable. The heat was unbearable. The discipline required to not fight back was inhuman. Garnier rode to Richard a second time. By now, the Hospitallers were in true crisis. Muslim cavalry had dismounted to shoot arrows more accurately. Hand-to-hand fighting had broken out. "Sire, for the love of God, let us charge." Richard's voice was ice. "Wait for the signal, 6 trumpet blasts. When you hear them, then charge, not before." "How long do we wait?" "Until I'm ready." Garnier returned to the rear guard without permission. His men were beyond fury now. Some knights were openly weeping inside their helmets, from rage, from pain, from frustration. And then, through the chaos, a trumpet sounded. Not 6 blasts, just 1. Maybe 2, but the Hospitaller Marshal heard it. And in his exhausted, heat-addled, pain-racked mind, he thought, "That's the signal." Or maybe he knew it wasn't, and just didn't care anymore. He kicked his spurs. His horse, wounded, bleeding but still strong, lunged forward out of the formation. One Templar knight saw him go, then another. 3 men charging into the entire Muslim army. It was suicide. It was also irresistible. More Hospitallers followed. Then Flemish knights. Then French cavalry. Within seconds, dozens of knights were thundering out of formation. Half a mile ahead, Richard the Lionheart saw his formation disintegrate. For 3 seconds, he had to make a choice. If he abandoned the charge, those knights would be slaughtered. The Hospitallers would never forgive him. If he committed, he was gambling the entire Third Crusade on a mistake. But Richard hadn't stayed alive this long by overthinking. "Sound the charge. 6 blasts." Now, the trumpet screamed. 6 blasts. The signal every man in the army had been waiting for. Richard spurred his horse and rode toward the rear guard at full gallop, his household cavalry behind him. The Duke of Burgundy and the centre divisions wheeled left. The Templars in the vanguard, hearing the trumpets, turned and began their own charge. In seconds, the entire Crusader army pivoted from defense to offense. What had started as 3 reckless knights became 1,200 armored cavalry moving as one mass, and then the real violence began. A heavy cavalry charge is not a battle. It's a natural disaster with intent. Each horse weighs 1,000 pounds. Add an armored knight with a 12-foot lance, and you have a moving wall of steel traveling at 30 miles per hour. When that wall hits infantry or light cavalry, physics does the rest. The first wave, the Hospitallers, smashed into the Syrian cavalry. Lances punched through shields and bodies. Horses crashed into horses. The entire front rank of the Muslim line folded inward. The second wave, Richard and the centre, hit moments later. The king himself fought at the front, not behind them. His sword rose and fell. Men died. Standards fell. Chaos spread like fire. The third wave, the Templars, completed the destruction. The Muslims weren't just being attacked from the front. They were being hit from 3 directions. The discipline that had held the Crusaders together for 12 days now became a weapon. The charge wasn't a mob. It was coordinated, controlled, devastating. Saladin's front lines shattered. Somewhere in the dust and blood, Richard killed the man carrying Saladin's personal standard. The eagle of the Ayyubids fell into the sand. For Muslim soldiers watching, that moment was psychological death. Your sultan's banner falling meant your sultan might be dead. Panic spread faster than any cavalry charge. Richard was everywhere, shouting orders, cutting down enemies, dragging wounded Crusaders out of the press. He wasn't leading from behind. He was in the middle of it, blade out, taking the same risks as his lowest footmen. On the other side of the battlefield, Saladin's world was ending. His nephew, Taqi al-Din, gathered the Mamluk household guard and tried to rally a counterattack. For a moment, it looked like it might work. Richard saw them coming. He raised his sword, pointed, and led a third wave directly into them. The Mamluks broke. Saladin stood with a handful of bodyguards while his army evaporated around him. He ordered drums beaten to rally soldiers who couldn't come back. Saladin hadn't been defeated. He'd been humiliated. Richard's cavalry pursued the fleeing Muslims across the plain. It was total victory, complete rout, and Richard stopped it. He rode ahead of his knights, raised his sword and shouted, "Halt! Reform! Not one step further." His men didn't understand. The enemy was running. This was the moment to finish them. But Richard was thinking about what happened to armies that pursued routed enemies into broken terrain, ambushes, counterattacks. "We've won," he told his commanders. "Don't throw it away by getting greedy." So they stopped, frustrated, blooded, victorious, and still disciplined. The unauthorized charge had worked because Richard had turned it into something organized. And now, even in victory, he refused to let emotion overrule strategy. Control wins wars. Chaos loses them, even when the chaos looks like victory. As the sun set over the battlefield, the Templars and Hospitallers searched for their dead. They found James of Avin. He wasn't famous. He wasn't a lord. He was just a knight, the kind of man who fought beside his brothers and never complained. He'd been in the rear guard when the fighting was worst, and somewhere in the violence, he'd fallen. The Templars found his body and carried it to the ruins of Arsuf. The Hospitallers followed. That night, they buried him. King Richard himself attended. He didn't give a speech. He just helped lower James into the ground with his own hands. A king burying a knight, no ceremony, no words, just respect. The Crusaders had won the Battle of Arsuf. They'd lost 700 men, mostly infantry. Saladin had lost somewhere around 7,000. What mattered more was what couldn't be counted. Saladin's aura of invincibility was broken. The Christians had proof they could beat him. The Muslims had proof their sultan could bleed. And both sides learned that this war was going to be longer and bloodier than anyone had imagined. The Crusaders marched into the ruins of Arsuf and made camp. The next day, they continued south to Jaffa. Within weeks, Richard's engineers had rebuilt the walls. The coastal road from Acre to Jaffa was secure. On paper, the campaign was a complete success. But Jerusalem was still 40 miles inland, and Saladin, though beaten, was not destroyed. His army had retreated into the hills. Messengers rode out calling for reinforcements. Within days, new troops were arriving. Saladin was rebuilding, and Richard was staring at a calendar. Winter was coming. If he marched on Jerusalem now, he'd be laying siege in the rain and cold, with supply lines stretched thin. The victory at Arsuf had bought him time, but time was something neither side had enough of. After the battle, Saladin sat alone in his tent, staring at nothing he refused to eat. He sat in silence, replaying the battle. Later, when his advisors tried to comfort him, Saladin said something surprising. "That king, Richard, do not mock him. Do not call him reckless. He is dangerous, and we will not underestimate him again." On the Christian side, Richard was hearing similar reports about Saladin. The Sultan had lost, but he'd retreated in good order. His bodyguard never broke. His courage never wavered. And now he was already rebuilding. The two men had never met face to face, but they were coming to understand each other in the way only enemies can. And in some strange way, they respected each other more than they respected their own allies. Richard had executed Muslim prisoners. Saladin had executed Christian prisoners. Both of them had crossed lines. But both were also warriors who understood what it meant to lead men into death and live with the weight of those decisions. Neither was a saint. Neither was a monster. They were both just men trying to win an unwinnable war. Richard never took Jerusalem. He came close. Twice, he marched his army within sight of the city walls. Twice he turned back. The politics among the Crusaders were toxic. Supplies were inconsistent. Winter made campaigning impossible. And Saladin, for all his losses, still held Jerusalem with 20,000 men behind walls that had never fallen by storm. In September 1192, a year after Arsuf, Richard and Saladin signed a treaty. The Christians would keep the coastal cities. Muslims would keep Jerusalem. Christian pilgrims could visit the holy city unarmed. Both sides would have 3 years of peace. It wasn't victory. It wasn't defeat. It was exhaustion dressed up as diplomacy. Richard sailed for England in October, never to return. Saladin died 5 months later, worn out, sick, haunted by the battles he'd fought. So what did Arsuf matter if the crusade failed? Maybe it mattered because it proved something both sides needed to know. That discipline could beat numbers. That defiance could save discipline. That warriors on both sides were capable of extraordinary courage and extraordinary brutality. The Battle of Arsuf didn't win the war, but it showed what victory looked like. And sometimes, knowing you can win is more important than actually winning. On September 7th, 1191, an unauthorized charge turned into a coordinated assault. Chaos became control. 3 reckless knights forced a king to gamble everything, and the gamble paid off. Discipline held the line. Defiance broke the enemy. And for one perfect afternoon, Richard the Lionheart proved he could beat Saladin in the open field. But war isn't won in an afternoon, and the cost of that victory echoed long after the last body was buried and the last banner was raised. They rode into the storm as men, and came out as something history would remember. History repeats. The question is, did we learn anything? Don't miss the next chapter. Subscribe now.